Might as well start, hey? Alright, welcome to Evolution. This PowerPoint supports the learning in under Controversy and Integrated Studies Term 2. The purpose of this video is to build an understanding of the mechanisms of evolution and how it all works, and the famous work of Charles Darwin. So to begin with, to really understand evolution, you really need to understand sort of the time scales that we're talking about. These are things that aren't very easy for human minds to get their heads around. The true vastness of time required. And so, as you can see from our PowerPoint here, we have a bit of a timeline of our understanding of how long we've actually been here. Okay, because until you can understand that, then you can't really understand the true nature of what evolution actually is. Okay, so back in the day, the only information we really had to go on was what people had told us from before. And so here we've got this person, James Ussher, who lived in between the 15 and 1600s. He came up with his method for figuring out how old the Earth was by looking at ancient texts and stories and things like the Bible as a factual record of history. And so what he did was he took the Bible, he took a bunch of families and people and characters from the Bible and tried to estimate the age of the Earth based on how many generations of people there had to have been in the past to support the stories that are portrayed in that text. As you can see, the Earth started at 6 p.m. on Saturday, October the 22nd, 4004 BC, making the Earth about 6,024 years old as of this year. Clearly that's not very accurate, but based on the information that he had at the time, that was a great bit of work. Moving on, we ended up with Georges Louis Leclerc. He came along a bit later, and he imagined that the Earth started as a big molten ball of rock and that it needed to cool down over time, and then once it became cool enough to support life, he would go through and figure out how old the Earth must be based on its size and the fact that it's made of mainly rock. Okay, and so what he did was he studied the cooling rates of lots and lots of different materials by melting them and calculating how long they took to cool down, and came out with a much more accurate view, not really, of how old the Earth is based on cooling rates of materials. And he came up, as you can see, with 74,832 years. That's how old the whole Earth had to be. Okay, again, like vastly off the accepted figure. James Hutton came along and looked at rock formations and realized that by looking at the layers of sedimentary rock and all the different kinds of stone and rock that are present on the Earth and how they seem to weather, and also things like when you look at an ancient lava flow of rock poured over another existing structure of rock, that tells you that, well, the rock underneath must have been older than the lava flow that happened above it, and things like that. So there are all sorts of very clever little things that people did to try and get a good idea of how long the Earth has been here. And he decided that weathering and erosion and rock formations happen so slowly that the Earth must be eternal. Okay, so it's basically going through an ongoing series of changes. Okay, and in reality, I mean, that the part of where the Earth is constantly sort of the surface of the Earth renews itself and constantly changes over time is pretty accurate. I mean, the oldest rocks found on Earth happen to be in Western Australia. So researchers found rock formations and examples of rock that are so old they are almost as old as the actual age of the Earth. And like I said, they're in Western Australia. So if you think about it, the stone formations, the surface of the Earth is constantly renewing and changing. Charles Lyell, who he didn't really speculate on the age of the Earth, but he understood that it was ancient and that the universe itself was a hell of a lot bigger than what we imagined at the time. See, there was a time when people didn't realize that, you know, the Milky Way galaxy was just one of billions of other galaxies out in the universe. So the neighborhood of where Earth is and where the Milky Way is greatly expanded with human understanding over time, especially once we launched the Hubble telescope that showed us some amazing deep field images. So Charles Lyell came along and realized that the Earth was ancient, but it did probably have a beginning. He, of course, didn't have enough data or information to hazard a guess. But what was really important about his work and previous fellow was that Charles Darwin, okay, my famous face, Charles Darwin read Lyell's work during the formation of his theories on evolution. And what Darwin really needed was some sort of accepted evidence to show that the Earth was extremely old, because if it wasn't extremely old, then the painfully slow process of evolution couldn't possibly actually be true, couldn't work. If the Earth was 6,000 years old, there's no way evolution could work quickly enough that it could possibly be correct. Okay, and so what Darwin really liked about Lyell's work was that he provided a framework up against where evolution could possibly be a real thing. Okay, and so just to finish the story of the age of the Earth, the only way, in the end, it turned out the only way we could figure out how old the Earth was by wasn't until we figured out how radiation works. And so basically people like Henry Becquerel, Marie Curie and Ernest Rutherford did all of the really early work in radioactivity. And when you know a little bit about radioactivity, it tells you that that you can use the amount of radiation left in natural rock formations to tell you quite mathematically and quite accurately how old certain rocks or bones or any other kind of particularly old fossils and rock formations actually are. Okay, so it's the use of radiation that actually finally told us how old the Earth was, and the Earth turned out to be about 4.5 billion years old. And just on a side note there, that the Moon formed roughly around the same time that the Earth did. Okay, so the age of the Moon is about the same as the age of the Earth. Okay, so this allowed Darwin to reason that through the process of natural selection, the Earth was old enough to support the diversity of plant and animal life that's out there. Okay, so what this told us was that the fossils that we found, the oldest fossils that we found in the Earth's crust, are about 3.5 billion years old, which is reasonable if you think about it. The Earth had to form, it had to cool, an atmosphere had to form, the water on the planet had to rain down on it from the neighborhood, basically. Most of the water came from we think came from comets and other objects slamming into the Earth over time, so that's where all of our oceans came from. And once the planet sort of stabilized and got cool enough and there was enough water and atmosphere around, it gave animals a chance, or early organisms a chance to finally form. So basically geology demonstrates that the Earth is old enough to account for the length of time it takes for a fossil to form. Now, if you don't understand what a fossil is actually a stone representation of a bone. So, for example, a creature dies and falls often to the bottom of a lake or an ancient seabed, and dirt and soot, silt and sand will cover that body. And if the conditions, this doesn't happen to everything, but if the conditions are correct, if the conditions are good, what will happen is the sort of the flesh and all of that soft matter that made up that body will eventually leach away and dissolve away and go back into the system to be recycled. But the bones will last long enough that the sediment around them will compact, and eventually the motion of water through those rock layers will dissolve the bones away over time. It's kind of why you never find skeletons in old shipwrecks, because bones do eventually dissolve into seawater. And so once the bones are gone, they're replaced by minerals. Okay, so slowly as the bone goes away, minerals replace them, and you end up with basically a a stone representation of what the shape of the bone was. Okay, and so that kind of is the process of how fossils form. All right, and that takes huge amounts of time, as you can imagine. Geology also provides support for the time it takes for organisms to evolve through natural selection. Again, evolution is something that is incredibly slow. So to recap that little bit, before Darwin, God created the earth, man is a masterpiece of his creation, and after Darwin, different species stem from the same ancestor, but how did great apes evolve into humans? And this is a fantastic little question that often pops up. It's one of my favorites. It says, people often ask if humans came from apes, then why are there still apes around? And that is just a question that often demonstrates that the person who asks that question really doesn't know how evolution works. All right, so this is a typical tree of organisms and a relatedness. And so in answer to the question that is often asked, why are there apes and humans on the earth at the same time, is because apes and humans are just as evolved as each other. They just came from a common ancestor that doesn't exist anymore. So if you follow sort of the DNA trail all the way back, and you find that, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, humans, they are all branches off the mammal branch that go off and had some common ancestor. So it is true to say that yes, you're not only related to the gorillas and the chimpanzees and the orangutans, to some original ancestor, but if you go back far enough along the branch of mammals, you're also related to horses and whales, you're related to lions and tigers and any other creature that basically has hair or fur and gives birth to live young. So that is basically the answer. And the further back you travel through the evolutionary tree, the more difficult it is to see the relationships, because the changes that have happened in that time have been much greater. So, for example, a beautiful example is the evolution of the whale. Okay, so this is a whale 48 million years ago, furry, 4 legs, teeth. Okay, this is a creature that slowly found its way back into the ocean. So it initially got out of the ocean long ago, a lot longer than 48 million years. It left the ocean and evolved lungs. Okay, now on its way back, the process 48 million years ago, you've got this furry little creature running around on the land. It slowly starts to develop webbed feet. It starts to probably lose its fur or modify its fur so that it doesn't drag on its body when it's trying to swim through water. So think sea lions and seals that have gone through the same process. Okay, and so these are also mammals that are kind of, you could imagine, are on their way back into the ocean. But because you can see this process is only over a few million years, which when we are talking about very, very big changes that they occur over many, many, many millions of years, but this is kind of like a very fast transition back into the ocean, which kind of accounts for the fact that the nostrils of this creature slowly made their way up on top of the head and across and all the way to the back where the blowhole is on a modern whale. So the modern whale's blowhole are its nostrils. And where did its nostrils start? Well, the same place that everybody else's nostrils, at the front of their faces, right? But over time, it was obviously far more efficient to be able to keep your eyes where you're going and maybe at what may attack you, while you could still breathe. See, at the moment, something like a seal has to take its head out of the water, almost completely, to have it take a breath and then go back into the water, leaving it vulnerable. Okay, so all of these little changes helped it return to the water, but they also happened rather quickly. So other evidence to show that this creature did walk on land at one point are structures such as inside the flippers of a modern whale, you still have the bony structures that were the sort of fingers of the original animal. Okay, so all those bones are still there. The lungs are a massive hint that this creature walked on the earth. There is absolutely no reason for a creature to evolve lungs if it never left the water. There's absolutely no point. You are far more you're far more efficient. You're far more better off if you have gills in water. But gills evolved over many millions of years. It took a really long time to lose them, and in the space of 7 million years or just a few million years, this creature went back to not only live permanently underwater, but to give birth underwater. Now, that is another huge deal when it comes to evolution, where you give birth. So this creature was giving birth on land. Okay, so it was a huge change to come out of the ocean initially, lose your gills, develop lungs over time, and start to give birth on land. Okay, and then to go back into the ocean. Down here, this creature's now gone back. It still produces milk for its young. It still gives birth to live young. It still has its lungs, but it's giving birth in water, which is another big change. See, seals and things like that, which you can see are animals that are slowly being modified to go back into the ocean, still give birth on land because they're still hanging on to that part of their of their evolution, what stage they're at. Okay, so whales are an amazing example of sort of evolution in action. Okay, so this of course happened to a lot of different creatures. Back when Darwin came up with his idea for natural selection and evolution, he really did not know by what mechanism, what process evolution actually happened. I mean, down on that cellular level. He thought back then that changes occurred after an organism was born, and that's completely wrong. So basically, the changes occur pretty much at the moment that an egg and a sperm get together. It's in that process, in that mixing, where changes occur. If those changes are good, for example, I may be a bunny rabbit and I live in the forest, and so when I'm born I happen to have brown fur, which is just great because it's really hard to catch me out there in the forest with my brown fur up against the brown dirt and the brown trees. Okay, but maybe my little brother got born with snow white fur, like really, really light fur. Well, unfortunately for him, he sticks out like a sore thumb. He gets eaten. I don't. Okay, and that's pretty much the basic idea of natural selection. Lots of random changes happen in the production of offspring. Sometimes those changes make you a little bit better off, and sometimes they make you a little bit worse off. Another example is you'll never find a white tiger in the wild, because any tigers that are born with the white with black stripes, again, they stick out like a sore thumb. So they find it almost impossible to sneak up on prey. And they eventually, when their parents when their mum gets sick of looking after him, and says, okay, off you go into the wild and fend for yourself, this poor thing cannot catch anything because it basically sticks out and starves to death, essentially. So you'll only ever find white lions, white tigers in captivity where they're fed. All right, so again, this is another trait which pops up once in a while, but like I said, if it's good in the environment that you're in, then it tends to hang on, so that animal gets to reproduce and pass on that trait more often. Okay, if the modification isn't good, well, then it tends to take you out of the gene pool pretty quickly, and so you don't get to pass it on anymore. And that helps to account for why many creatures have very, very similar traits for the environment that they're living in. Okay, and the same is true for us. I mean, this here is an insanely famous fossil. This is Lucy. Okay, it was named Lucy. This is a humanoid ape person that walked on two legs. Okay, still very, very furry, not very tall, quite a small animal. But it was found in 1974, and it was dated at around 3.2 million years old and found in Ethiopia in North Africa. Now that again gives us a little bit of an idea of, well, this is where humans came from. That's where we believe humans originated, in Africa, and then spread out of Africa into sort of the rest of the world. So Lucy is, this was what we found of her, and then it was put together, and then with a whole lot of work and some artist representations, a guess at what she looked like was created. And so she is definitely, well, one of our direct ancestors. Okay. Another insanely common diagram is to show the slow changes. This is a great diagram to demonstrate or try to explain sort of the length the length of time that it takes to make a significant change. See, when Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands, he found one of his great discoveries were birds that were almost exactly the same as each other on different islands, except each of these birds had slightly different beak structures and slightly different sort of areas that they lived in, environments based on the different islands that they were on. And the Galapagos Islands are just a collection of islands that are off the coast of South America. And so basically what he theorized was that these islands are actually the tops of mountains and emerged from the ocean due to volcanic activity. So at some point they were basically naked islands. There was nothing on them. They just poked out of the ocean over time with nothing on them. Okay, but you go there now, it's covered in vegetation, lots of different animals, all sorts of things like that. So there's a huge diversity of life on them right now. And so obviously it followed that all of that life arrived on these islands sometime after their formation. And given that they would have taken a really long time to form and have been there for millions of years, the idea was that obviously these birds arrived just like the Galapagos, like a whole bunch of reptiles arrived there, the turtles arrived there, lots of seeds and pods floated there during storms and things like that and landed on the beaches, and then it started the vegetation and all of that sort of thing. So what Darwin suggested was that these birds, when they arrived, were all the same birds. They all came from South America, but as they landed on individual islands which were a little too far for them to fly, or they tend to stay in that in their one particular island, the birds over the tens of thousands of years that they've been there slowly adapted to the specific conditions offered by each island, accounting for the slightly different shape in beak and behavior. All right, and so that is an indication that evolution isn't as slow acting as people often imagine, but significant changes do take a huge amount of time. So, for example, you imagine yourself standing there, and let's say you have your brother and your sister, and then you guys say have grown up, and your brother and sister, and you guys have had children, and then your children look like you look like your parents. And I don't mean you resemble, but I mean like you are clearly human, okay? Your kids are clearly human, your parents are clearly human, your grandparents are clearly human. They don't have any weird sort of evolutionary changes or traits or differences to you. You all are clearly of the same species. Now, you go to grandma, grandpa, great-grandma, great-great-grandma, great-great-great-grandma, you will notice that there is no point where you can look into the future of into the past of your ancestors and then look back at your children, your children's children, their children's children. You know, within a very quite a long time period, you would not notice any significant difference between any of these individuals of the human species, right? But when you take that and extend it over really significant amounts of time, like millions of years, then you start to see changes, like significant changes between individuals of one group that are, say, the ancestor of another following group. Okay, so when we get to, and this is one of the great myths that often happens, is saying that if you're here on Earth and you're maybe you're Caucasian, sort of, maybe you're Anglo-Saxon, or you've got your friend who's Indian, or you've got your friend who's Chinese, or your other friend who's Native American or Australian Aboriginal. People often like to imagine that one group may be, smarter, or they're more evolved than another group of current humans. But where people really fail to understand evolution is that every individual, every human on the earth comes from the same ancestor. When we get to that point where humans appear, well, it's that human that then gives rise to all of the variety of the races, for example, of people out there all over the world. No human is biologically really any different to any other. And the greatest test for that, the greatest test to show relatedness is, can one individual mate with another individual that may look completely different and give rise to offspring that can also go off and mate and then give rise to more offspring? So if that is possible, then you are the same thing, okay? There is no difference. So another beautiful example are dogs, and you can see some incredibly different looking physical attributes for different breeds of dogs, from very, very small to very, very large. But the reality is that every dog can mate with another dog and produce more dogs, okay? And so those sort of superficial differences in maybe, like for humans in skin color or eye shape or whatever, are really, really, they really are superficial. They make no difference to who is human and who is not human. There is no one human which is more human than another. Okay, so that is a really, really important distinction to make, okay? So just like breeds of dogs or breeds of horses, or you name it, or birds even, you are that. Okay. All right. So this now leads us to what this aspect of our unit is going to be about. Okay. So this is controversy. What we're studying right now, and so out of the enormous amount of work that was done leading up and building a decent understanding of the reality of the world, where it comes from, how old it is, and where we all come from, there was some work done long ago in England. Basically, there was a discovery made by a fellow who unearthed a skeleton in Sussex in England in 1912. Okay, and it was found in an area called Piltdown, so they called it the Piltdown Man. Here, Charles Dawson, Elliot Smith, Charles Dawson, Arthur Smith Woodward. They are there studying this amazing fossil that was found in Sussex in England. Okay, now they dug this up during, these are basically amateur scientists looking, because now you can imagine back in that time, making that transition from a very faith-based and sort of magic-based reality or understanding of where the Earth came from and what's in control and what's going on, to a much more scientific explanation where the Earth comes from and where we all come from. It was incredibly exciting for the people of the time, and there was a huge amount of interest generated back then in things like evolution, especially from Darwin's book on the origin of species and all of the other work that had been done. Now, remember, fossils have been around, have been known for a very long time. Humans have known about fossils for thousands and thousands of years. The Romans knew, the ancient Greeks knew about fossils. They're there in the land, they find them. But what nobody really understood was what they were, what they meant, where they came from. Okay, it took a really long time for people to finally put the pieces together and go, oh wait, these things used to be here, but aren't anymore. Now that gave everyone the understanding that something called extinction could happen. All right, so there are creatures that were around once that aren't here anymore, which really goes against the accepted view that the Earth was created in 7 days, and that the Earth was populated with all the creatures that it had right from the beginning as they are. So from the first day of the Earth, there were horses, cats and dogs and zebras and giraffes and things like that. Now, to say that creatures could cease to exist, that was a really big deal, and that did elicit a huge amount of interest. And so a lot of amateur scientists kind of got on the bandwagon trying to figure out what's going on and see if they could contribute their own knowledge and their own discoveries. So they go out digging, okay? And so this is one of those people, and came up with the Piltdown Man. And so this is Eonthropus dawsoni, or the Piltdown Man. Now you can see Dawsoni in the nomenclature of the sort of the binomial name. Dawsoni was attributed to Dawson, Charles Dawson. It's basically named after him because he found it. All right, he found it in this place here. Okay, there's the Piltdown. This is a small map, and where basically they found, there's the dig site where they found the fossil, and so this was the site where they found it. Okay, and these are the pieces they found. Okay, so the Piltdown Man, they then tried to, if you go back to this diagram, they try to go and see where Piltdown fits. Like how far away, how long ago was Piltdown Man in our own evolutionary journey to becoming human? And so they tried to fit it in. So here they've got 1865, they found Neanderthal. Okay, in 1859, Darwin's Origin of Species was published, so just after that. 1908, discovery of hominid bone fragments in Sussex, England. Okay, and 1912, public presentation of Piltdown Man. Okay, so Piltdown Man was incredibly significant. All right, and let's see. So the importance of discovery, evolution theory launched a major search for the missing link. Now, I really have a problem with that. You can't really. It was a really big thing of the time, very fashionable to go looking for the missing link. And as you can see, again, back here, we can find evidence of these creatures all having existed at some time period before us, okay? But to look for a missing link, it really isn't a useful thing, a useful statement to make. For example, where does this missing link, is there one creature that really connects us to our ancestral, ancestral examples here? So, in other words, where would you put the missing link, is what I'm saying, okay? Is the missing link between this guy and this guy? Or is it between this guy and this guy? Like, yeah, where's the missing link? It's not a smart question to ask, okay? But boy, was it fashionable at one time to look for the missing link, and so really, it's not a real question. But back then, they were really gunning for the missing link, something that would somehow demonstrate that yes, this was definitely a thing. You know, we have not always been here, okay? And in reality, out of the 3.5 billion years of life on this planet, we really, on that scale, we got here about 5 minutes ago, okay? Very different to what people believed, that, you know, the Earth was created for us, and in reality we just turned out to be a naturally occurring thing. Piltdown Man, now, so evolutionary theory, okay, looking for this missing link, and I've just gone into why I can't stand that term. Piltdown Man met theoretical expectations. The brain size, this Piltdown Man was, what they were looking for is, if you look at an ape's skull, and body structure, you notice a few things. You notice that the brain case is actually quite small, and the jaw is usually quite large, or at least comparable in size. And the reason for that is because the jaw is used as a tool. The jaw is used to rip into things, break bone. You know, it's used in the survival of the creature. Now, you look at a human face and human skull, the jaw is much less, it's more understated, because the brain case has gotten bigger, which means tool making became something we did with our hands, and we stopped doing with our mouths and our strength. And so we, you know, a gorilla can, you know, kill you in about 1 second flat, right? It is incredibly powerful. But then, you know, a human can go off and invent things and build things that make sure that, you know, in a fight, the human always wins in reality. All right, so we got rid of our fighting and our capabilities, because we replaced them with our knowledge and our ability to make things. And the more we did it, the bigger our brains got, and it took a really long time. So what they're getting at here with the Piltdown Man met theoretical expectations was that the brain size of Piltdown Man was similar to that of the human brain, of the human skull, meaning that the Piltdown Man is a very recent relative of the human. Okay, so the jaw is similar to an ape, and that was supposed to be the link. So in other words, they didn't just dig up some guy that died, you know, 100 years ago and got buried in the mud. That this wasn't a human. This was definitely something other than a human, but pretty damn close to a human. Okay, so, and this was the first major British paleoanthropological discovery, and that there was a really a big case for celebration when it came to sort of the nation rivalry of who found what and when and how significant it was, and everybody wanted to be the ones that contributed the most. And the British were, really at the forefront of it, given that Charles Darwin was British. So then we move on. This is nearly finished. The jawbone. The jaw was interesting. It was like an ape's jawbone, but the teeth looked more human. Again, this fit with theoretical expectations. So basically, the fossil was ticking boxes that people wanted to see in order to say, yes, this is a real thing, okay? And I think this is the last slide, okay? The tools, okay, so the skeleton was found with tools, okay? And the tools were made from elephant bone and had been sharpened. This showed that Piltdown Man here was not only on the way to becoming human, but had learned how to make tools and make more and more sophisticated tools, which then again fits in with, where it all ended up with us, okay? All right, so I guess to recap, evolution takes a huge amount of time. So the closer we get, the closer we are, our branches are, the more similar we are. But the further back you go, the more diverse the organisms are. And yes, and one thing that tends to be a really interesting idea to get your head around is that you standing there or sitting there watching this are able to trace back in an unbroken line an individual that came before you and then came before that individual all the way back, unbroken line, to the very, very first expression of life that occurred on the planet out in the deep primordial oceans, okay? There is an unbroken line of life that goes all the way back from you and everybody else. Because there is no way, if you think about it, that an individual, yourself or any other, can have occurred with no predecessor. So there is a predecessor that takes you all the way back, unbroken line, to the very beginning. Okay? I reckon that's pretty special.